I've seen many videos comparing Team Fortress 2 and Overwatch 1 and 2. These videos are usually made to compare mechanical differences, so I wanted to make a video about my opinions on a different area, the feelings of both games. Feelings are, of course, something very subjective, so I do not expect you to agree with everything I say in this video. I just wanted to talk about something that interests me. This video is intended for people who have experience with both of these games. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other, although I will admit that I have a slight personal preference for TF2. I've played Team Fortress 2 since 2011, and I've played Overwatch since the beta in early 2016. Both games hold a special place in my heart, and I often come back to them even if I haven't played in a while. The first thing I'd like to talk about is engine differences. Team Fortress 2 uses the Source engine, and Overwatch uses an in-house engine. In my opinion, the physics of the Source engine are a lot more fun, especially when it comes to explosions and knockback, which have become important game mechanics for rocket jumping as Soldier, sticky jumping as Demoman, sentry jumping as Engineer, and the option for every class to use enemy explosives to blast jump themselves, which is especially important for classes with relatively low mobility and offensive options, such as the medic when he needs to get out of a difficult situation. This mechanic rewards skillful players who understand the quirks of the Source engine, as opposed to Overwatch, where mobility options are not uniform, cannot easily be taken advantage of by creative enemy players, and rely on cooldowns. Cooldowns, and particularly get out of jail free cooldowns, such as the abilities of Moira, Reaper, Kiriko, Orisa, Zarya, Sombra, Baptiste, and to a lesser extent Tracer, often feel like a clutch, rather than a game mechanic that rewards skill. They are more designed to be mechanics that reward tactical thinking, knowledge about abilities, and how long they take to get up again. But this can feel unfair towards the opposing player, because it can often feel like they were just about to score a fair kill, only to be disappointed, because the enemy pressed Shift or E on their keyboard once, and became completely invincible. Of course, such abilities exist in Team Fortress 2 as well, such as with Scout's Bonk, and especially Medic's Stock Uber, but they are the exceptions, rather than the norm, and both of these abilities can be countered with Pyro's Air Blast. Because of this, individual 1v1 matchups in Overwatch often feel more like a game of understanding each other's cooldown timers, rather than rewarding aiming and positioning. The concept of ultimates is also difficult to properly place for me. On the one hand, they are great dopamine hits for the person who uses them, particularly when they are one of the more overpowered ults, such as Junkrat's Wheel and Reaper's Die Die Die. However, they are like random crits in Team Fortress 2. Great for the temporary dopamine hit and the feeling like you are doing great, but it's very unfair towards the enemy player, because there is barely anything you can do to prevent it, unless you're being hyper aware or have a competitive level of experience. Though, to be fair, Overwatch 2 has, at this point in time, added a new hero called Torbjorn, which actually has a great ult that goes against the get a free kill philosophy, because it simply makes Torbjorn's secondary railgun shot charge automatically for a temporary amount of time. This encourages players' skill with aiming, and is a much more fair ultimate for both you and the enemy team, compared to most ults in the game. And I really hope that Overwatch 2's future heroes continue with this design philosophy of encouraging skillful play with ultimates. When playing Team Fortress 2, I also play on community servers, such as on Oncotopia, that remove random crits from the game. And it is this option of player choice that I really like about TF2. If there's a game mechanic you don't like, you can just create your own server. And if the community likes it, that server will thrive. Overwatch has options for creating custom game modes, which have resulted in a lot of funny and interesting creations from the community, such as the Floor is Lava, Reinhardt, and Overwatch Smash Brothers. However, it pales in comparison to the custom maps and community servers of TF2, which has tools for making your own maps. This has resulted in a very large amount of custom game modes, such as vs Saxon Hill / Freak Fortress, Prop Hunt, TF2 Wear, Defron, TF2 times 10 or even times 100, randomized weapons, and much more. And those are just the game modes. We haven't even begun to talk about the maps yet. For example, surfing maps, jumping maps, Mario Kart, and the many maps made by the community that were added officially to the game, such as Sunshine, Egypt, Moss Rock, and the best map, Harvest. You get my point. Team Fortress 2 has given the community the tools in order to get creative and add their idea to the game. And I think this has increased Team Fortress 2's sustainability and longevity for a lot of players. Team Fortress 2's characters are very well designed. There are a lot of videos about this already, but it's worth mentioning again, because quickly recognizing a class in a fast-paced shooter is very important. Even though TF2's cosmetics can be rather distracting sometimes, you can still always see the color of their team and the distinct shape of their body and silhouette very clearly. Overwatch relies on red outlines in order to differentiate between teammate and enemy. And while I personally don't think that's a bad idea, I do feel like more often than not, I recognize an Overwatch character in the game coming towards me more because of Overwatch's great sound design rather than the visual design of the characters themselves. Speaking of Overwatch characters, there's a lot of them, and they keep adding more, making the game's roster more difficult to balance as well. But the biggest thing I've felt is that often, Overwatch characters often just feel like changing your weapon loadout in TF2. A lot of Overwatch characters are based on TF2's weapons or playstyles. For example, Mercy is the Medigun, Anna is the Crusader's crossbow, Zenyatta is a pocket medic with Jarate who can headshot, Zarya is the Vaccinator, Widowmaker is Sniper but if the Razorback was actually good, Hanzo is the Luxman, Pharah is a stock rocket launcher, Torbjorn is a worse version of Battle Engineer with a sentry that feels like it only has 10 HP. Now, of course, this is a simplification of things. It should be noted that all the characters I just listed were characters that were released early on in Overwatch 1's lifecycle. A majority of the characters in Overwatch, and especially the characters added after the early period, feel unique and make the game feel a lot less like a TF2 clone and more like its own unique game with its own identity. One of the best things about Overwatch is its sound design. The game design relies heavily on its great sound design, and it does a wonderful job at it. You can recognize exactly which character someone is playing simply by listening to their footsteps, and enemy footsteps are always louder than the footstep sounds of your teammates. Each ability and ultimate in the game has its own unique voice line, with variations for if your teammate is using them or if your enemy is using them. It's very useful, and more often than not, the sound key for an ability or ult is more quick to recognize than the actual visual and hitbox of the ability or ult. This greatly enhances the clarity of the flow of the game and gives attentive players in the backlines a great tool to prepare for incoming flankers. This design philosophy would not be able to work in Team Fortress 2 because the game wasn't designed around it. For example, imagine if we actually added loud enemy footsteps for classes such as Spy, Scout and Pyro. These classes, which rely heavily on flanking, will become completely unviable because of the loss of the element of surprise. And speaking of Spy, Team Fortress 2's backstab mechanic, well, sometimes very unfair because of the bad and outdated hitbox registration system, is a great example of a satisfying mechanic. Compare this to Overwatch's Sombra, which has a similar role to Spy, and it becomes quite clear that Overwatch's balance philosophy feels very different than TF2's. Sombra, which used to get a 40% damage boost to hack targets, now only gets a 25% damage boost, which makes her a lot more difficult to play for the average casual player. Overwatch's balance philosophy is based on the top 5% of players, competitive players, and often does not take the way that the characters are actually played in casual matches into account, which is what the majority of the player base actually plays. Characters in Overwatch get balanced and reworked a lot, resulting in a totally different game experience if you haven't played the game in a few months. This was especially bad with Symmetra. There were hopes that this will become a little less with the release of Overwatch 2, but these frequent balance changes and reworks have unfortunately continued to be implemented, not accounting the initial great reworks on the release of Overwatch 2, such as Brigitte, and the removal of many stun abilities in general. I personally really hated Cassidy's stun in particular, because it made his entire gameplay based on hitting that stun and getting that free insta-kill with Van the Hammer. Now he actually needs to aim, and that's a lot more fair, because it rewards skill rather than getting lucky with a weird hitbox. I still have the words "whoa there" living rent-free in my head. Anyways, the big issue here is that Overwatch balances the game for competitive players and not for the average casual player, and it's especially bad when competitive players and influencers complain about certain things that are not even relevant to the majority of the player base, because it often results in changes that only benefit competitive players and make it more difficult for the average player to enjoy a character with a high skill ceiling. Another good example of this is Zarya's recent nerfs. Zarya has always been a difficult character to play for most new players, but now it has become even more difficult. Even though the changes from Overwatch 1 to Overwatch 2 were great changes for her, she now needs to fill the role of both a main tank and an off tank at the same time, which becomes even more difficult with the recent nerfs. It's many little changes like these that add up and make many of the characters less approachable to new players, who are not even close to having the required high skill for high skill ceiling characters that enable competitive players to do these things in the first place. One of the biggest examples of this is Tracer, which used to have 225 HP, but because competitive players were so good as her HP was nerfed to 150 HP, making her very difficult and less fun to play for 95% of the player base, in order to satisfy the 5% of competitive players. TF2's balance approach is, relatively speaking, a lot more hands-off. The biggest balance change TF2 ever had was splitting the equalizer into the new equalizer and the escape plan. In TF2, a lot of the recent big meta changes when it comes to strategies and playstyles happen through the community rather than the developers. Some great examples of this include the recent trend of people temporarily switching to engineer in order to quickly upgrade the teleporters to level 3. The more widespread usage of console keybinds for placing engineer buildings, switching vaccinator resistances, and switching loadouts quickly, for the Jack effect for example. Teammates actually standing still in order to properly receive crossbow heals. Pyros helping with spy checking, making the engineers and medics on the team feel a lot safer. Leaving metal for engineers. Leaving health packs for medic. Aggressive dispenser placement around corners, so that heavy can have infinite ammo for sustained fire. Spies, crazy trick stabs that take advantage of hitbox knowledge, and even mini sentries on defense when your team has multiple engineers, in order to create an aggressive and surprising style of defense from unexpected angles. In short, the meta in TF2 feels like it is stable, yet healthily adjusting with small optimizations from the community. In contrast to Overwatch's aggressive and sudden "fuck you" approach, which aims to appeal mostly to competitive players, a very small percentage of the user base, with the exception of Brigitte's launch balance of course. Speaking of the meta, it should be noted that when playing Overwatch, even in quick play, your team often expects you to play very seriously. Because of Overwatch's 5v5 format, there is little room for error. If one player is not playing optimally, or god forbid, is a friendly, the rest of your team will often be very negative towards you, since this is not how you're supposed to play the game. Team Fortress 2's 12v12 format encourages player experimentation and getting creative with changing up your loadout and strategies. After all, it's alright if you make a mistake or do something weird just for the fun of it, because you still have 11 other players by your side who can avenge you. The feeling of high expectations aren't really there in TF2, unless you play competitive stuff like Highlander or 6v6. Overwatch's 5v5 mode is very punishing for new players and discourages them from thinking outside the box. It's also just funny having multiple people playing the same class. Well, except if it's sniper or spy, of course, we don't need 6 of those. Because a well-balanced team is still important if you actually want to win. And Overwatch's role queue does a great job at this. The only disadvantage of role queue is the fact that no one wants to play support. My recommendation for this is to change the role requirements to be 1 tank, 3 damage, and 1 healer, because a lot of players simply prefer to be DPS characters, since the majority of Overwatch characters are in the DPS category. This is very understandable, and you will often see team compositions like these in open queue. One of the biggest issues with Overwatch is the 50% win rate matchmaking algorithm. The matchmaking algorithm in Overwatch often forces you to play against players that are either way above your skill level or way below it, resulting in games where you often either roll the enemy or the enemy rolls you. It's relatively rare to get a game in Overwatch where you really feel like you are on equal skill level as your opponent. This happens a lot more in TF2 because of the 12v12 format, which is more forgiving for mistakes and deviations from the meta. This results in some days where you can play Overwatch for 2 hours and only get matched against people way above your skill level, resulting in you constantly losing. This is frustrating and not fun, because Overwatch is at its best when both teams are equally skilled, because this creates the most memorable and intense fun moments, where you really feel like what you're doing matters and contributes to your team, rather than cheap dopamine spikes when you roll the enemy or the frustrating feeling when you get rolled yourself. Another big difference in Overwatch is that the 5v5 format creates very different fights than TF2, because the 5v5 format encourages your entire team to be present in the same fight. This is what is often referred to as the team fight, and the momentum of these team fights are often very quickly decided by the team that manages to secure the first kills. This creates a lot of moments where you have to respawn and wait for your teammates to respawn as well, because if you go alone, there's a high chance you will die, and this creates a very still meta of people constantly grouping up together in order to win small team fights, rather than having the fights take place on all corners of the map over the course of the entire round. There are many maps in Overwatch that have areas that players will almost never come to, because these are not relevant areas for non-flanking characters, of which there are relatively fewer in Overwatch compared to TF2. This isn't a bad thing, but it's a noticeable difference in design philosophy and the way players play the game, and expect you to play it as well. Deviation from the norm is discouraged, both by the game and by your teammates, who will often become quite negative towards you for feeding. And that's another big unfortunate point when talking about Overwatch. The community of Overwatch is, on average, a lot more toxic and divisive compared to Team Fortress 2's community. And this is especially noticeable in the in-game chat, where in Overwatch it's a lot more common to get called a racial, homophobic or transphobic slur, and many theoretical situations that involve your mother. The developers have tried their best to be more attentive when it comes to cracking down on toxicity in Overwatch, which I applaud them for, but it is still not enough, unfortunately. The culture surrounding Overwatch is just a lot more aggressive in general. The irony of this is that Overwatch has tried its best to create an inclusive and diverse cast, with arguably mixed intentions and results. Yet a vocal part of the community seems quite the opposite of inclusive, relatively speaking, to TF2's community, which is unfortunate. I'm not saying that TF2's chat can't be toxic, because trust me, it can. But Overwatch 5v5 formats and the generally more serious expectations from your teammates create an environment where every small mistake means a lot more. This creates, willingly or not, more opportunities for people to get angry at, which is unfortunate. We need to talk about Torbjorn. As a medic and engineer main in Team Fortress 2, Torbjorn has always been a huge disappointment to me, because not only is Torbjorn not able to place buildings such as dispensers or teleporters, Symmetra feels that well and she does it poorly, only being able to place teleporters in her own line of sight and from a limited distance. The only building he has, his turret, is absolutely pathetic. Not because players don't get creative with it, they tried, but because it is in a game that is full of characters that can easily kill it, and quicker than Demoman and Soldier could dream of. Because the turret in Overwatch feels like a pathetic version of a level 1 sentry, but with even less HP, and a large amount of mobility cooldowns in the game make it almost impossible for Torbjorn to secure a kill on a lost squishy, which could have easily been the case for a TF2 sentry against the average scout player, without using his gun as the secondary source of damage, which surprisingly actually has a higher skill ceiling than all of Engineer shotguns, because Torbjorn's gun is able to hit headshots, which makes Torbjorn arguably more effective at combat than his turret, which is a completely different design philosophy from the Engineer in TF2, because your sentry actually provides the most amount of damage, and your shotgun serves as a useful secondary source of damage, though less powerful than a highly skilled Torbjorn who can land all his headshots, making it possible to secure a kill on a majority of the characters you will see in the game with only 2 shots. The headshot mechanic in Overwatch is really cool and actually quite fair. It raises the skill ceiling of a vast majority of the characters and encourages players to improve their aiming, and rewards players for landing their shots. Headshots transform otherwise squishy, weak characters like Zenyatta into terrifying murder machines that can theoretically one-shot you from across the map if they're playing well. Another thing that Overwatch does better than TF2 is its melee hit registration system. It feels a lot more fair. In TF2, there are many interesting subclasses, such as the Demo Knight, which rely heavily on TF2's melee hit registration system, which essentially shoots out an invisible bullet in front of you to simulate a melee hit. It's very bad compared to Overwatch, especially because in TF2, your melee hits can be absorbed by a friendly teammate. But it gets worse, because TF2's lag compensation makes enemies even more difficult to hit, or even worse, makes it easier for your enemies to get a melee hit on you, when it really seemed like it shouldn't have been possible. This is especially bad with Spy's backstab mechanic, which can abuse the game's lag in order to get backstabs on you while it clearly shouldn't have been possible, even being able to backstab you directly through your face. In Overwatch, none of this is an issue, because the melee system actually feels fair, because the hitboxes of most Overwatch melee attacks actually line up more fairly. But it gets even better, because melee dependent characters like Reinhardt and his hammer have, relatively speaking, compared to TF2, amazing melee hit registration that always feels fair and powerful. Compare Reinhardt's hammer swings to a Demo Knight's puny weapon swings, and the difference will feel like night and day. This makes characters that heavily depend on melee attacks, for example Tracer, feel a lot less unfair when it comes to delivering that final blow, because the melee options in Overwatch are always reliable and viable, unlike TF2. I mean, just look at this Torbjorn clip. Another thing Overwatch 2 does better is its ping system, which is a very useful way to alert your teammates to various dangers and opportunities in the game. And in general, communication in Overwatch is slightly more efficient because of the 5v5 format, especially when you are with friends in a voice call. It's much easier to coordinate a push in Overwatch than it is in Team Fortress 2. If you have a group of 2 or 3 friends playing TF2, it's enough to make a play, yes. But in Overwatch, that number weighs a lot heavier because of the lower amount of players in your team. Playing with friends in Team Fortress 2 can sometimes even encourage unhealthy habits, like pocketing your soldier boyfriend as a medic, for example. In general, Overwatch 2's communication feels more efficient and tactical. It's easier to coordinate pushes, also partially because you do not need to rely on medic's stock Uber to push through sentry nests and choke points. The larger amount of characters in Overwatch makes it so that each map feels unique, because there are so many possible character combinations. In TF2, you often have to guess what weapon an enemy is using, but in Overwatch, a player with around 10 hours of experience will usually understand most of the abilities they will encounter in the game. While there are a lot of things about Overwatch that are great, there are some things outside of the games that are also important, and in my opinion, Team Fortress 2 has left a bigger legacy than Overwatch in this category. With the countless amounts of funny Gmod animations, SFM videos, memes, video essays. For example, someone made a 12-hour video discussing Badwater. But most importantly, there is something that Overwatch will simply never be able to replicate. And that is Team Fortress 2's soul. There are so many little things that make the culture of playing TF2 unique. The loud sounds of the pan being spammed, doing a funnily timed dance taunt with the enemy team, until you kill your character using a bind that causes all your ragdolls to either explode or drop helplessly to the floor like a horde of fish, while the music suddenly stops. The honorable melee duels, where both players will only use their melee weapons out of mutual respect. Killing the 6 snipers on 2 forward that can't hit anything. And the friendly hoovies, crouching around the battlefield, giving you a free sandwich, no matter what team you're on. Actions like these will get you kicked in Overwatch servers as soon as you leave the spawn room, or even worse, the people on the server will start using rather aggressive language. And it is a testament to the strength of the soul of TF2, the fact that the community moments like these are cherished as happy memories, worth preserving, rather than frowned upon by its player base. In conclusion, I would say that TF2 is more fun for a larger and more casual oriented player base. It rewards individual skill and player creativity. Overwatch 2 is more fun for a more competitive oriented player base. It rewards tactical thinking with cooldown management and coordination. Both games reward positioning and game sense in different ways, and I would say that both of these games are great, for different reasons in general, and whichever one you prefer is completely up to you. But personally, I have a slight preference for Team Fortress 2, because it is simply more fun for me. It's not as punishing, and it's less stressful to play if you just want to have some quick fun, since Overwatch in general requires a lot more caution, and sometimes I'm just not in the mood for that. Sometimes I just want to play scout and hit a sniper with a fish, and then do a stupid love taunt, and then promptly get killed by another player trying to do something funny to me as well. Because that's the thing, Team Fortress 2 will never not be funny. It's a game where a lot of fond memories were created, and where these memories continue to be created as well. It's a timeless classic that will always be fun to come back to. But it's not about which game is better. It's about the fun and the friends we made along the way